I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing AI, not simply as a legal technology or governance issue, but really as an organizational transformation issue. Nearly every major organization is experimenting with AI. Many have AI strategies, pilots, deployed tools, and leadership attention on this really important development in our technology. Yet, for many organizations, there is a growing frustration. The promise of AI is clear. The technology is increasingly accessible, but the real business transformation is elusive. And that may not just be a sign that AI is overhyped. In fact, I think we're still very early in our AI journey. So the challenge is not just adopting a new tool, it is at times fundamentally redesigning the way people, processes, and organizations operate around it. That said, from a legal point of view, we are also seeing additional frictions in how organizations can adopt AI. That friction comes from a number of places, including in the AI governance programs that companies have adopted to address the many risks associated with AI. Complaints relating to governance programs include that the review process just moves too slowly. It doesn't allow for agility and nimbleness, that the review program doesn't capture the right information to be actionable, or that the ultimate conclusions from that governance program leads to a destination where leadership does not end up making the risk-based decisions needed for AI adoption. And that is a real problem that puts two things at odds: responsible use of AI on one hand, and the transformation potential through the use of AI on the other. That dichotomy is really the focus of today's conversation. What does it take to move from AI experimentation to AI transformation? How should organizations think about a technology that can help fill in missing information, write, draw, code, predict, but still fundamentally depends on human judgment? And if judgment is essential, then who is empowered to exercise it? And how does AI reshape the decision making inside those organizations? All of those questions embody the fundamentals of a governance program. And at this moment, it's time to reassess. To help explore those questions, I am happy to be joined by Avi Goldfarb, the Rotman Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Healthcare at the University of Toronto. He's also the co-author of two best-selling AI books, one called Prediction Machines: The Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence, and The Power and Prediction: The Disruptive Economics of Artificial Intelligence. There are few out there who are pulling together economics expertise and applying that into thought leadership on the development and implementation of AI more than Avi. And so I'm so happy to have Avi join the podcast to explain his unique perspective on AI, economics, and human decision making. Avi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, you have written extensively about artificial intelligence and how businesses are using AI, how they're deploying AI, and how they're making decisions with AI. maybe kind of start with the beginning because I think one of the things that I have noticed and I hear from clients all the time is that nearly every major organization is experimenting with AI. Many have different types of pilots, many have different types of deployed tools, different types of implementation. It's really at the top of mind from the boards down to senior management down to kind of every level of an organization. And so the energy is certainly there. But I think oftentimes, I think there is a sense of frustration that all of the promises that AI can bring haven't really manifested in the way that everyone was anticipating. And so I guess the question is, from your experience, do you see it the same way? And do you have a point of view as to why that may be occurring?
Absolutely. So the current wave of AI started with ChatGPT's launch on November 30th, 2022. And that wasn't that long ago. So in the 3.5 years since then, AI has taken off. Prior to that, when we were talking about AI 2021, 2020, most organizations outside the tech industry hadn't really done much at all. They hadn't even used AI for many, many basic functions that those tools were good for. And now, when you look at the data, most large organizations have an AI strategy, they've deployed, and AI is useful for something. So we've made incredible progress. What a lot of companies are still missing is that meaningful business transformation. The sense that AI allows them to do something different than they did before, or enables a new kind of product or service. And that is, if you look at the history of general purpose technologies, like these technologies that have transformed the way we live and the way we work, like the steam engine or electricity or the computer, it can take a long time from the technology being obviously useful till it makes a big difference for most people at home and at work. So with electricity, for example, the the main commercial hype around electricity started as early as the 1880s. Edison's patent for the light bulb was in 1880. But it wasn't until the 1920s that most US households and most US workplaces, or at least most US factories, were electrified. So it took 40 years to figure out what a new house and a new factory might have looked like. And what took so long was in the early days, what they did with a light bulb is they replaced the candle. And that was useful, but houses and our lives were sort of structured around candles. And so it wasn't such a big deal. Okay, it's a different kind of light. It was only once they started to design new kinds of buildings or changing sort of the time of day that you're awake and asleep that it made a meaningful difference to have this electric light. And the same kind of thing was happening in factories. With AI, there's lots of ways that it feels like we're still in the 1890s, right? We can see that this technology is going to be transformative. And many, many workplaces have already touched it and started to experiment with it. But we haven't quite figured out for many organizations what the factory of the future looks like. So we haven't redesigned our processes yet to fully take advantage of what the technology can do. And that's going to take time. I don't think it's going to take 40 years, but we're 3.5 years in, and there's lots of major transformation still to come.
It's a really insightful kind of point, right? Like, because I think oftentimes there's a view of this is that, while AI has been around a very long time, the generative AI certainly has been around only relatively recently. And how those tools can be used effectively within an organization to achieve that type of transformation, one, may not have been fully thought through yet, and two, kind of ignores the human component of how organizations are structured, right? Because the example that you brought around Edison was a great one, because if you were to go back to the early stages of Edison and electricity, you'll see that there's a lot of human conversations that are happening and a lot of human debate between him and Westinghouse and Tesla around how that technology was going to be adopted. And it wasn't at all efficient. It wasn't at all kind of ways where like, oh, here's this great technology. Now we know how to use it, or even what type of technology was going to dominate. It resulted in a lot of consternation, and it was only over, as you said, decades where there was that full embrace and understanding of how it can be leveraged as part of their business. So I'm interested in kind of that component of things because I know one of the areas that you've studied and you've written about is, just how organizations, work with the development of new types of technologies and how they can embrace that technologies. And then importantly, where their expectations should lie around the power of that technology, whether it's something that is truly, technology is being predictive and can be replacing individuals, or whether it's really something different that we should better understand the technology first.
Great. So on that first part, thinking through like where does the innovation happen? As you pointed out with electricity, we think of the innovation as happening at General Electric and Westinghouse, and it did, but a lot of the innovation happened downstream. So one of the biggest innovators in the transformation of the economy because of electricity was Henry Ford. You don't think about Henry Ford as an electricity innovator because, he made cars. But part of what he did was redesign the factory. So Henry Ford and a few other factory owners around that time realized that electricity enabled a different kind of factory, where sort of what you might think of as the quintessential 20th century factory, where you have modular production and inputs out in one end and outputs out the other. That was possible because electricity allowed you to put your machines wherever you wanted. Right? So it wasn't just cheap power, it was distributed. Because if you think about before that, your factory would have been powered by either steam or water. And that's one core central power source. And every single machine in the factory has to be connected through a belt or a shaft or something or some gears to that core central power source. And so we used to organize our factories around that central power source. But it was factory owners, not the GEs and Westinghouses, but the downstream factory owners who realized that electricity allowed them to build a different kind of factory. And so what I expect to happen with AI is something similar. Yes, absolutely. The AI companies are going to innovate in lots of different ways. And there are still lots of open questions about what a successful and profitable AI company looks like. And at the same time, downstream of that, there's going to be innovation in law firms, innovation in financial services, innovation in manufacturing, and all over the economy on, okay, well, we have this AI. What can we do with it to transform what our organization is capable of? And that innovation is, we're starting to see that experimentation now. It's pretty cool. But we haven't quite figured out like the Henry Ford style factory where you could say, this is what electricity enables. We can put this distributed power allows us to build a different kind of factory. In most industries, many, if not most industries, we haven't quite figured out what that looks like.
No, I think it's a really good point. And, I think one of the things that I think organizations are struggling with is that they're hearing really from the top, hey, you need to adopt artificial intelligence in connection with whatever function you were talking, right? The legal team needs to adopt AI tools. The marketing team needs to adopt AI tools, right? In other words, there is clear direction and support for pulling on new tooling. But just giving access to a tool is not the same thing as that digital transformation that you were talking about, right? Like think of in the legal industry, you have somebody, let's say that they were, 30, 40 years ago, and they were used to looking up case laws in a book. And then they say, here's Google, here's Westlaw, here's LexisNexis, go do things more efficiently. As you can imagine, like that's not a light bulb, right? To borrow your prior analogy that you can just flip on, right? That's something that takes a long period of time for adoption, including at multiple levels of the organization to establish not only the ideas about how is it that you can use it, but importantly, what are the guardrails on how you can use it effectively. So that takes time, which was your initial point. I guess is like, how is it that successful organizations can position themselves to accelerate their AI journey to get a competitive advantage, especially when these types of tools are widely available to all of the market participants.
Right. I would think about it. There's two different ways to understand this. This is a technology like any other technology. And so when we have a transformative technology, whether it's the internet or computers, there's certain processes and certain frictions that you'd expect. So in that sense, I would expect, for example, that most organizations are going to look at their existing workflows, identify opportunities to use AI within their existing workflows first, drop the AI into that exact point because messing with the workflow is no fun. Leave the workflow the same and become incrementally better. As a normal technology, I would also expect sort of some challenges as it empowers some workers and automates others. And those challenges could be on both sides, right? You think about what happened when we went to the word processor. In law firms, as I understand it, in many other industries, you had a whole set of type people whose job was typing. And interestingly, word processing didn't automate typing. You still needed somebody to type, but it made it that you didn't have to be that good of a typist in order to type effectively. And so the knowledge workers themselves could become the typists because they could delete when they make mistakes. And that transformation happened slowly. Like the last person who was still dictating in law firms, I'm not sure, maybe there's still a few of them. Um, but it happened. And there was resistance both from the people who ended up being empowered by the technology, the knowledge workers, and from the people whose jobs were being displaced. So there's all these frictions when we have this technological change, and you should expect that again. The other piece, though, is what's different about AI. And what's different about AI is it helps you fill in information. So that's what it does. Under the hood, it's computational statistics. But you don't have to think about it that way. You just need to recognize that it's an information technology. And anytime you're filling out information, AI can help. Whether that's medical diagnosis, whether that's filling out a form, et cetera, et cetera. You're filling out information, AI can help. And so what that means is you need to tell, or I shouldn't say you, a human needs to tell the machine what matters, what you're trying to accomplish, use their judgment to say, this is what we need to do. Then the machine can help you do that by filling in all sorts of information. And where the friction happens there, and that you really need to be extremely careful about, is yes, the machine is helping you fill in information, but which human in your organization or outside of it is telling it what to do? And so the high level point is the machine doesn't provide the judgment. The machine doesn't say to you what matters. Okay. But once somebody says to the machine what matters, the machine can accomplish incredible things already and even more so over the next few years. Which means that even though machines aren't ultimately making decisions, a lot of the friction happens because they can change which humans make decisions. And so it can be, you might think it's the leadership of your organization, and then it turns out once you use a certain AI, you're delegating a lot of the real brain power involved to your vendor. In which case, what are you there for? Or you had an example where there was AI was making one division of a company less important and another division of a company much more important. And that led to all sorts of frictions, including that the division that became more important didn't have incredible talent at the time because they'd never been respected in the organization. And so they had to go out and hire a whole new team. So all of these frictions, which is that the machine fills in information, it makes a prediction, humans provide judgment. That's the key skill, but it might not be the same humans once you've deployed AI at scale for transformation that are happening, that are making those decisions today.
So, like that redistribution of decision making as being a key consequence of the adoption of AI is really fascinating. I want to unpack that just a little bit because, one of the things that is commonplace is that the developers of artificial intelligence based systems and technology and solutions are often third-party technology companies, both existing large players and new entrants into the market.
Yeah.
There are companies who are operating outside of the AI space who have their own versions of artificial intelligence, but they're really kind of more of the exception than the norm. The technology is being sourced from somebody else.
Yeah.
And if I take kind of one of the consequences of what you're saying is that when you're adopting a new type of technology, that can be a really helpful resource, but know that there was a set of, call it values, a set of judgments, a set of kind of weights and measures that were implemented by that third party vendor in the development and ongoing deployment, which reflects the point of view of the developer, not necessarily the point of view of the user. And that difference matters, especially, when organizations are competing with one another and they're trying to look for competitive advantages, and also that they are using that technology to implement a vision and a set of objectives than necessarily just letting the computer make those decisions for them.
Absolutely. And as an old example, a science fiction example, you ever see the movie I, Robot? Remember that movie? Okay.
I do. Will Smith, I think.
Will Smith, yes. Will Smith plays Detective Spooner, and he hates robots, right? And so the whole movie is about why he hates robots in this world of robots. And I don't know if you remember, there's this flashback scene about why he hates robots. And in that flashback scene, that he and a little girl, they get into a car accident, and for reasons that aren't entirely clear, they're both about to drown. And then a robot comes, and the robot saves him and not the girl, and that's why he hates robots. Now, accepting that it's fiction, nevertheless, what happens is it's a robot, so he can audit it. He can figure out, well, why did the robot save him and not the girl? And it turned out the robot made a prediction about each of their likelihood of survival. The robot predicted that Detective Spooner, Will Smith, had a 45% chance of survival, and the girl only had an 11% chance. And since 45 is more than 11, the robot saved him and not the girl. And then Will Smith's character goes on to say, but 11% was more than enough, and a human being would have known that. Well, that's a statement about judgment, right? We have an explicit prediction here, 45 versus 11. And then he says, well, 11 is more than enough, which means that that girl's life is worth more than 4 times an adult man's life. I don't know that all humans agree to that. But what's important to recognize is even in the science fiction world, it's not that the robot interpreted a life as a life because that's just something inherent about robots. There must have been some team working for the robot manufacturer or for the government who embedded values, like engineers and ethicists and others, into the robot that says every life is equal. And that team's judgment of what matters ended up being scaled to the whole world. And so it's not that like that decision remains human, as in you would have had a human rescuer on the ground making the call who to save, or you have some team of humans embedding their values way in advance into the robot. That human judgment remains essential, but it does change who gets to judge. And a lot of these opportunities and challenges in AI are about that last step. Who gets to judge? Is it in your company? Is it outside your company? And if it's in your company, who within the company?
And that, I think, is a really important point because we're at this moment in time where many organizations have recognized the great value that AI can bring, at least the promise of that value, if they haven't achieved it yet. They have also been well advised to understand that AI is going to present a number of different types of risks, both theoretical and pragmatic risks. And I think the advice from many lawyers in my position and others has been around, hey, you need to establish a means by which you are governing that technology. In other words, not just letting the technology govern you, but actually having the right stakeholders to bring to the table to be able to evaluate those technologies from a variety of different points of view, including to try to understand perhaps maybe some of what you were describing as judgment, others would describe as potentially biases that are inherent in the solution itself, whether those are intentional or unintentional. And it's left to this core group to then make these decisions. I think over time, while those are good ideas, that has been a source of frustration because having kind of that one team responsible for looking at all of the many aspects of AI and trying to understand how that technology works from top to bottom to then understand what the appropriate use cases are and then disperse those appropriate. It's a huge responsibility and a huge task. And I think there's a sense of perhaps frustration with that group of saying, like, hey, we feel like we're almost bottlenecks, or there's kind of views of like we can't move fast enough, can't have access to the right types of information to be able to do so. There's a lot of senses that it's not working as efficiently or as effectively as what it was designed to be. Interested in your view as you are taking kind of that insight that you shared. How is it that organizations can say, okay, I recognize that an AI technology is not completely neutral, that it has some sort of point of view, whether intentional or unintentional. How is it that I can be able to both identify what that is and then be able to act accordingly to recognize that point of view and respond to it?
Right. So the first step is to remember that it's not a machine's point of view, but it's the humans who embedded their values into the machine's point of view. So, yes, you're going with a vendor, or you're building something in house, but there's nothing inherent in the underlying models that creates values. Those are trained. And so those are trained based on decisions. And you need to sort of go out and talk to the people who are making those decisions. To the extent you're going with a vendor and it's for some particular application, it's I find that it's really helpful before you go to the vendor to figure out what the KPIs are. Okay, so before you go talk to somebody, figure out what you're trying to accomplish. Use your judgment to say, here is what matters. Here's what success looks like. Because otherwise, once you go talk to a vendor, they'll convince you that whatever they're good at is what matters to you. And that's not what you want. So first step is it's not a machine decision, it's a human decision. The goal is to understand which human. Second is discipline yourself to, before you go talk to the AI companies, try to figure out what you're trying to accomplish and be specific about what matters. And then the third part is well, once you have your KPIs, you want to benchmark against them and measure. And that can be really tricky because, as you pointed out earlier, there's plenty of evidence of machine bias, for example, that it doesn't quite do exactly what's perfect. And so if you're benchmarking machines against perfection, if that's what you think you need in order to delegate certain things to an AI, then it's going to be a lot harder to get people comfortable with that machine, maybe for good reason. If instead you're benchmarking on your old processes, however well you did before, there's plenty of evidence on many different dimensions that machines outperform humans, especially around bias and discrimination type metrics. If you want a machine that's not going to be biased, it's not going to be perfect, but it's quite likely to be better than whatever human processes you have in place. And so again, thinking through, so one, machines don't make decisions, understand that. Two, figure out what the benchmark is, what your KPIs are, and then go out and evaluate against those KPIs, presumably not against perfection, unless that's what's absolutely necessary. Then you have sort of a path to effective implementation. We're still in a point solution world. We're probably still not thinking about digital, like true transformation, where you're building an entirely new aspect to your business. But often those first steps of getting things up and running and organized are necessary before you can think through what you can do differently.
And you have any thoughts about, who should be making these types of decisions? Because I think a rational human being is probably not only kind of looking out for the success of the organization that she or he represents, but also looking at, what does change mean for them
Yeah,
individually in their career, in their standing within the organization. And as you pointed out earlier, that, AI has the ability of dispersing decision-making authority, and there will be likely winners and losers in connection with that dispersion. So that seems to me is that maybe that 95% of the time works fine, but in the minority of cases, there may be a real disconnect and different incentives between the individual figuring out whether AI is going to impact them versus how is it that they are trying to accomplish an objective for the organization.
absolutely. So if you're, and here it depends whether we're still thinking about we have our existing workflow, and we're trying to identify AIs that'll sort of improve our existing workflows versus on the transformative side. On the existing workflow, that's straightforward. That's individual managers doing their job. Every year, there's some new tools, new technologies that come out that allow them to do what they always did, but a little bit better. And AI on the point solution side is no different. So if there's an opportunity from a vendor for you to be able to do what you always did, but a little bit better because you can improve this part of the process or take out this bottleneck and put in something more efficient, great. You do not need high level approval. But if you're thinking about true transformation, new products, new services, increasing the importance of one part of the company, decreasing the importance of the other, that requires buy-in from the CEO. The idea doesn't have to come from the CEO, but it absolutely requires buy-in from the very top. Because as you pointed out, it's going to be, some people are going to be more important, some people are going to be less. There are going to be real frictions. And you need somebody at the top who's willing to say, no, this is important enough that we're going to ride out these issues. And the organizational temptation toward just sticking with what we always did, like the state dependence of doing the same thing every state, every period, over and over again, that needs to be pushed away if you're going to move toward transformation.
Yeah, and I think it's really an important point. Maybe that's my last question for you, Avi, as we kind of wrap here. Um, as you're working with senior leadership within organizations, let's say you're advising a CEO and they have really been convinced that there is a disconnect between kind of this AI experimentation between true AI transformation. They recognize that it's going to be time that they may be able to get there. But any kind of single bit of advice that you would say, how is it that I can start a new trajectory if I need to tomorrow? What are those key first steps that organizations can take to right size their objective for AI versus what it is that they're actually seeing on the ground?
So that's a big question in a few minutes. So we'll do what we can. So first thing is just the explicit recognition of what this technology does. It helps you fill in missing information. Okay. And not, it started as statistical prediction. Under the hood, it's still statistical prediction, but we now have machines that can write and draw and code. And anytime we need to fill something in, the machine can help. Okay. And that is a tool that's going to be valuable like all over many, many different organizations. But so that's like, half of the first point. But the other half of it is, but it's not a machine that's making decisions for you. You still need to decide what business you're in and what you value. And so the human judgment, the skill in recognizing the opportunity goes hand in hand with the technology that allows you to fill in missing information better. And maybe we can summarize all of that as you need to understand that machines don't make decisions. They do a lot of things, but they don't make decisions. That needs human judgment. And for transformation, that has to come from the top. Then the second point, once you understand that part, then you need to think really carefully about what matters. What are you trying to accomplish? both at a high level and then in terms of your KPIs. And then once you have that, once you have the understanding of what the machine can do, and you have an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, that's when you go out and really seriously consider the various vendors to see who's there to help you and what, if anything, you need to build in-house.
I think that's really insightful. I mean, another ways of describing that is that, AI's promise of transformation is real, except humans are still at the center of making all of that happen. And in other words, it's just putting more opportunity in front of humans to distinguish how is it that they then take this technology to accomplish all of these objectives, which I think maybe is a different message perhaps than many in the folks are or are fretting about the future of the job market and the future of labor in general. This could really be a message of saying, listen, humans are going to matter more than anything else. It's just that the way that we operate and work is going to be different.
Absolutely.
Well,
Well
Avi,
said.
I really appreciate your time and sharing your insights with our audience. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to continue this conversation in a future episode.
Absolutely. That'd be great. Great talking to you,
Great.
Scott.
Yeah, same here. And with that, I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.